Why, hello, and welcome to the Georgian Book Club. So I have a video for you this week. It's not the fielding. We can't do two fieldings in a row. But the fielding is coming along very well. I've been listening to it walking to and from work and to and from the gym, and I'm nearly halfway through. So the next one we do will be Tom Jones. But this week we are having a look at Alexander Pope. So I've got my very ostentatious wig on today. Next time I'll have the black wig on because we'll go travelling with Tom. But no, we are in London. We are among society. So the very ostentatious wig for Pope. But before we start, remember, if you would like to support us, there is our shop where we have books and writing services. There is also our Redbubble shop where we have over 100 designs. So if you'd like to support us that way, be our guest. If you would like to support us without having to spend any money, that is also fine. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. In terms of getting the videos out there, liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing are probably more important than spending money. I didn't say that out loud. Don't let any of the others hear I said that out loud. Anyway, we are looking today at a very early Pope poem. It's one of the ones in here, and I've actually done something I never do. I put little taggies in here so that I can remember what I want to talk about, because there are little bits along the way that I'd like to read, and I don't normally do that, but it's just the nature of the poem and what I'm wanting to talk about, and I knew I'd forget, so I taggies match my flowers. Anyway, so we are looking at the essay on criticism, which is one of the earliest of the Pope poems in here. It is one of his very early poems in terms of him gaining recognition for his poetry. And it is an essay in the same way as the essay on man is an essay, which is kind of an unusual thing. You don't sort of think of poems and essay. Because, when you think of poems, you think more, pretty words and a narrative, especially in this period, a narrative. But this is genuinely an essay. It's not like the Rape of the Lock, and it's not like the Dunciad, which we've also already done. It actually, in terms of its content, in spite of being a poem, it actually is more like Peribathos, but with less invective, and certainly less invective than the Dunciad. So this is Pope young and fresh and not jaded by the Georgian literary scene. And the essay on criticism is in 3 parts. The 3 parts of his essay are the introduction to the essay, which is the nature of criticism, the true nature of criticism, how criticism has developed from the classical world. The second section is the dire state of criticism today, and the third section is how criticism should be and how criticism got to this dire state. He is very scathing of the English critic, but then again, so is Fielding. So it's a sort of a perfect piece to pick up and have a look at while I'm reading Fielding. And Henry Fielding's Tom Jones has an awful lot about the critic. So this is a genuine essay, which is an unusual thing to put into a poem. But Pope's natural form, it appears, is poetry. And so I think I do find that many of these Augustan writers, one of the things that is interesting about them isn't just that they were writing, you know, the fictions or the poems or the whatever that they were writing, but they also wrote a lot about the book trade. Whether it is Swift's Bickerstaff papers or the Battle of the Books, whether it is Pope's Peribathos or the Dunciad. Pope actually seems to be quite vociferous in his attacks. And he gets more so as he gets older and more jaded. He becomes increasingly vociferous about this. You get Fielding, who started out his career in the theatre and then moved to novels after the licensing act drove him off the stage. But we'll do more of that next time when we have a look at Fielding. But Pope is particularly interested in not just writing, but the world of books, the world of, the literary world is something he is quite, he talks a lot about. And so it actually probably shouldn't be too much of a surprise that the thing that brought him to notice is a piece about critics. So you actually, one of the interesting things reading this, because I've never read this before, is how many quotes we get from this. You have quoted Pope without knowing you have quoted Pope, much the same way people have quoted Shakespeare without knowing people have quoted Shakespeare. For all that Pope has fallen out of fashion a lot with more contemporary audiences, and we know who to blame for that, romantics. Pope has actually had a significant influence on our language, and one of the things is via this early poem. So we get tuneful fools, a little learning is a dangerous thing, to err is human, to forgive divine, and fools rush in where angels fear to tread. You are quoting Pope. Now, working through this with my little tags, assuming I can read this because I'm not wearing my glasses, is there are just some little things that as I was listening to this, I did cheat. I have not had a lot of time lately, so I have been availing myself of LibriVox, which is a bit hit and miss. If you get one with a narrator you like, it's great. The Tom Jones that I'm listening to has one narrator and it's really good. The other one that I listened to was Joseph Andrews. The narrator of that was really good, and the narrator of Rassilais was really good. So if you are actually, and the narrator of this was okay. I mean, it wasn't as good as the others, but was okay. It's all volunteer, so, you know. But I will leave a link to LibriVox down below because, oh man, is it a lifesaver. And if you're not really familiar with reading 18th century stuff, it really does help to have it read to you, especially if you don't have a lot of time. So, yes, I will add that down there, but I listened to this, which was, a lifesaver. As I said, too many books on the run make for very confusing. But so as I was listening to this, certain bits struck out at me. That's why I tagged them all, because I was following on with my book. And the critic, the role of the critic in Pope's opinion. In Pope's opinion, and who am I to argue with Pope? Who am I to argue with Alexander Pope? In the first part of the essay on criticism, the proper role of the critic is, then criticism the muse's handmaid proved, to dress her charms and make her more beloved, but following wits from that intention strayed, who could not win the mistress wooed the maid. So, and then against the poet their own arms they turned, sure to hate most the men from whom they learned. One of the precepts of criticism that Pope sees as laid down by the ancients is that criticism is a learned thing and should augment the art itself. That a good critic is as valuable to an artist as is more valuable to the artist, really, than just empty praise. Empty praise does nothing for the artist, but a good critic who can actually say, this is good and this is why it's good, and who understands that, and who is not flattering and not envious and not doing things from all these nefarious motives that will be ascribed in the second part of the poem, is as helpful to the art itself, to the muse. It's the maid to the muse. It helps the muse dress. It helps the muse, the poet, create something that is beautiful and able to, go forth showing its best. That is what a good critic can do. A good critic is not there to tear the work of the muse down, but to augment it, so that the poet has both the lady, the muse, and her maid assisting him. The him being the typical view of poem of who the poet would be from Pope's perspective, but him or her. The muse is the one who gives and the maid assists. Now, what Pope is criticizing is the idea that because people have decided that the best way to get to the muse is via her maid, they have flattered the maid, they have flattered the critic, and they've ignored the lady herself, so that they are going for critical acclaim, but not really necessarily getting to those elevated heights, purely because they are going for basically the approval of somebody who is not the highest order, but the servant of the highest order. Because Pope's conjecture of why critics must be beyond reproach is that a bad writer is like, okay, well, that's fine, but a bad critic can lead people well astray. People with taste are going to find out a bad writer pretty quickly, but a bad critic is going to mar multiple writers in the minds of the public. That the public may trust this critic, but if the critic doesn't know that their job, they will, praise stupidity and create what we now know as the land of dullness. The most terrible thing to befall. Clearly, too many critics spoil everything. Too many poor critics. A good critic will poke you where it might hurt, but because it's necessary to allow you to tighten it up. But a poor critic, a flatterer, will get to dullness. Though Pope has not become quite so cynical yet. It's still there, but he's not old and cynical and disappointed in many things as he becomes when we hit the Dunciad. The next thing we have is the fact that poets don't necessarily always follow the rules. And that's another thing that he contends, that critics have to give that leeway, that you have to understand the rules, but then you have to be able to see when an author is is sophisticated enough to break that. As kings dispense with laws themselves have made, moderns beware, or if you must offend against the precept, ne'er transgress its end, lest it be semble and compelled by need, and have at least their precedent to plead. The critic else proceeds without remorse, seizes your fame and puts the laws in force. So the critic is there to sort of hold the line. So there are going to be exceptions where the line, where something is so spectacular, so innovative, and so worthy that deviation from the line is absolutely permissible, because it doesn't do it too radically. And I think Pope is quite conservative, but even his own verse is a deviation. It's not exactly the line, because Pope is a Augustan poet. He is an Augustan poet, and we soon discover who he is talking about, that deviation from the line. He has a very particular poet in mind, and he has a very particular poet whom he is clearly indebted to, and to whom the Augustans are indebted to, and we will get to that in a moment. So, but the next thing that we have is that the critic needs to be learned. Now, Hatter talked last week about the importance of an educated audience, and Pope is likewise advocating for an educated critic, because a little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep, or else taste not the Pierian spring. Their shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again. So if you have a little bit of knowledge, and then you spread that about, you're very quickly going to discover exactly where your insufficiencies are. And you're going to look the fool. You're going to look the drunk. But the more you know, the more informed you are as a critic, the more sensible and sober your criticisms are, and therefore the more respectable you are, because nobody respects a drunk man, but they do respect the sober man. So what we've had a look at so far is his talk of, in the first part, what the ideal critic is, how the ancients and nature have set down the perfect model, and that a critic and an author need to be on the same page for both of them to work at their bests. That this is the self-evident truth of writing, according to Pope. Now, our second part, we discover things that Pope thinks are wrong with modern criticism. And one of these things is ostentatious writing, which I think is kind of ironic, because when I think of Pope, I think of it being opulent. I think not so much ostentation, but just the thing that strikes me is the opulence of the writing. It is like Handel's operas. It is big, it is rich, it is frothy, it is pretty. It's like a Baroque painting. It doesn't mean that it is pointless, but I find the opulence of it, the fun of it, the froth of it is one of the things that really surprised me when reading Pope. I thought Pope was going to be really dull and heavy, and when I found that Pope dances, it was really a great joy to discover that, because it's like, oh, this was not what I thought it was. So Pope declares that over use of language that is ostentatious, not opulent, but ostentatious, where it is so much language, what we would call purple prose these days, is not good. And that a bad critic will praise ostentatious language over the content and the form, that it's just many, many feathers or many, many leaves on a tree, but you didn't really notice that the tree doesn't flower and the tree doesn't fruit, which makes it a bit useless as a fruit tree. That sort of thing. So words are like leaves, and where they abound, much fruit of sense is rarely found. False equivalence, like a prismatic glass, its gaudy colours spreads on every place. The face of nature we no more survey, all glares alike without distinction gay. But true expression, though like the unchanging sun, clears and improves whatever it shines upon. So the opulent language of Pope is still clear. This still reads as an essay. You can understand this as an essay, even though it is poetry, and even though we have that very distinct Popian rhythm of his poems, the Dumpty Dumpty Dump, which Wordsworth attacked. And it's like deeply unfair that Wordsworth attacked that. I've talked about that before, because Pope himself attacks the exact same things Wordsworth attacks, which is why we don't like Wordsworth and why we're not doing Wordsworth. Because I like Pope, and he went and attacked one of my favourites, and we don't allow people to get away with that, do we now? No. And it's partly his fault that Pope is so forgotten, which is a real shame, because Pope is fun. Okay, so next, what we come across is the actual critic that Pope thinks is the great critic. He is the only critic who is a modern who Pope mentions in a positive light. He mentions a couple of others in a negative light, and they were critics of this person. And that person is John Dryden, who was a critic, playwright, poet, translator. Now, I had some Dryden. A lot of these books I bought ages ago. I decided I'm gonna read a load of poetry. I didn't read them all. I did read a lot of them, but I didn't read everything. One of them was John Dryden. Now, I'm not a fan of 17th century anything. I find the 17th century writers often far too religious. I like some Marvel, his early sexy stuff rather than his later boring religious stuff. I like likewise some of John Donne's some of Donne's romantic stuff, but not his religious stuff. And Dryden, at least the version, the copy of Dryden that I had seemed to be, it's more religious stuff, and it's a translation. Now, Dryden translated the Iliad, as did Pope. And Dryden is not a metaphysical poet like Marvel or like Donne or like early Milton. There's one I'm reading. Once I worked out Paradise Lost, is like, it's apology to Cromwell. It's like, well, that's dull. I'm not reading that. Kidding? Ugh. That's way too religious for me. But I found that I don't really have a great interest in reading long poems about Old Testament people, because, I'm just not. Sort of like Handel, I like the operas, not the oratorios. I'm not terribly keen on the religious stuff. I'm not a big fan of Bach. Same reason. I just don't find it terribly, it's not my thing. So I had sort of not really read Dryden. But since I noticed, Dryden keeps turning up. Why is Dryden turning up? And Dryden sits in this really odd position. He's seen as a classicist, not a metaphysical and not an Augustan, but he is sitting in that position where there's a flip from the metaphysical to the Augustan. So he's a transitory poet, which is probably why he sort of does straddle that. You get the religious Old Testament-y things, and then you get this classical stuff. And although I haven't read the religious Old Testament things, clearly he is bringing that classical quality into these poems, which hadn't been there before. Because one of the things that Pope has a problem with Shakespeare is that he's not classical enough. So we do, which was in the preface to Shakespeare, which we did along with the Johnson's preface to Shakespeare. But one of Pope's issues was that Shakespeare isn't following the classical rules tightly enough. But of course, nobody did in that period. So Dryden is obviously bringing this classicism into English letters, and therefore his criticism is very much in simpatico with Alexander Pope. He was poet laureate under Charles II and James II. He died in 1701, I believe, so within Pope's lifetime and about 8 years before Pope wrote an essay on criticism. So he was clearly an influence on Pope. He also converted to Catholicism, which was also Pope's religion. So I think there was clearly quite a sympathy between Pope and Dryden, and Pope sees himself in this in a direct relation to Dryden in terms of the next step along into the fully developed, totally what we would consider Georgian style. Pope is at the forefront of this, and he's at the forefront of this and recognizing this transitory figure, which is quite interesting, because actually once we get Tom Jones finished, I actually have a bunch of videos planned that are also going to look at transitory figures, but for the other end of the 18th century, what was the transition. What are some of the interesting transitional texts between the more Augustan writers, the more, like Pope, like Swift, like Fielding, like Johnson, and then into the Romantic period? Because these things don't happen just overnight, they don't happen overnight. There is always that transition. It's like Haydn. If you think of music, Haydn is a transitional composer. There is a big difference between the very Baroque composers and then the classical composers, and then actually even into the Romantic composers. Beethoven is another one of those transitional composers, which sort of straddle both things. Interestingly, Haydn taught both Beethoven and Mozart. But that sort of not quite Baroque, not quite classical, not quite Romantic, is quite normal as you jump between epochs. And so Dryden is one of those people, and I want to actually have a look at some writers who also fall into that category, but between the very, very Georgian and the Romantic. Sorry, I really deviated there and went off into a bunch of different things, but you'll forgive me. I know you will. The next thing that we get of a criticism of what is happening in criticism today, as it were, is that critics paying attention to the name and praising the name. And in all honesty, a lot of the things that Pope is having a go at about critics are pretty... Nothing's changed a lot in over 300 years. Really, not a lot has changed in over 300 years when we talk about criticism. How many books have you read or reviews have you read and you think, and then you've read the book and gone, that was awful. That was awful, but it got praised to the skies. Why? Because of who the author was. I mean, films are the same way. They're all very, a name will sell something. rather than, good taste. And here we get the line, which is a wonderful lines. Of all this servile herd, the worst is he that in proud dullness joins with quality, a constant critic at the great man's board, to fetch and carry nonsense for my lord. It makes me think of the Earl of Oxford and the Oxfordians. What woeful stuff this madrigal would be if some starved hackney sonneteer or me. But let, O Lord, once own the happy lines, how the wit brightens, how the style refines. Before his sacred name flies every fault, and each exalted stanza teems with thoughts. I mean, Pope is no less barbed in his youth than he is in old age. The difference is he becomes more cynical in dullness than in this. This one is much lighter and fluffier. Not fluffier, frothier. Not fluffy. There's no fluffy bits. Actually, that is one of the things. There are no fluffy bits. Fluffy bits are something he says you can't have. But it's bright and it's frothy and it's fun. And he's being sarcastic. And then finally, as we have traversed our issues with criticism, modern day criticism, as we have provided a line for critics to follow in our third section. And then finally we end by talking about how criticism fell from grace and that she has never really picked up, especially not in England. She has in some places that they do it better, but ultimately in England they do not do it well. And that this is a problem, according to Pope. So the essay on criticism does work as an essay as well as a poem. It's probably, I would never have thought that poems and essays could live in the same box, the same Venn diagram. Essay over here, poem over here. Normally they would be two separate circles, and Pope has managed to make them a single circle, which is no mean feat, especially the essay itself being not a terribly old art form at this point in the early 18th century. The essays of Montaigne were only translated into English from French in the very late 16th century, so in Shakespeare's time, and so they had only really got currency in that early 17th century as a form. The 17th century is quite an upheaval-y century, and people are spending way too much time squabbling over religion, which is why we don't do the 17th century particularly. So the essay is still malleable, much as throughout the 18th century, the novel is still quite malleable. It hasn't been perfectly set and given strictures the way that it will later on as the century and centuries progress. That nowadays no one would dare submit a poem as an essay. I mean, you could. I have no idea how you mark such a thing, but you absolutely could do it. But I think you need, one of the things that Pope had in his favour was a very strict form for the poem. So because he was working within a very strict form, it allowed him to be quite innovative with the content. If, however, you are working within a very loose form, you have to be a bit stricter with the content. There's a push-pull there. An essay poem, as opposed to a narrative poem, is quite a different sort of thing. So I will have a look at some of the other essays, or these longer form poems that are kind of odd. There's also a pamphlet that I was debating whether I would do that or this, and I will bring that eventually, probably when I need something quick and haven't had a chance to read much, because that's what I keep these writers for, is for those I need something quick, because they're prolific and they did write quick things. So anyway, that is an essay on criticism. A lot of it's still valid. It's very, very, very worth reading or listening to. And next time I will be bringing you Tom Jones. So next time, I hope you enjoyed this, and next time I will bring you Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. I'm not going to take down my original one, but I'm going to, like I did with Werther, here is a reread and what that's like. So until then, goodbye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.